In 1993, the movie Philadelphia was released.
Mr. Beckett! How are you? What happened to your face?
I have AIDS.
Oh.
The story of a lawyer fired from his job for having AIDS, and who then, with help from Denzel Washington, goes on to sue his employers. It was the first major movie to address the epidemic, and was a key moment in the battle to fight the stigma surrounding the disease. But in 2022, Hanks said that if the film was happening today, he wouldn't appear in it.
I don't think anybody would accept a straight guy playing a gay man. Because why wouldn't somebody gay play somebody gay?
Do you think that's right?
I think it's current. If, motion pictures are supposed to capture the truth, and if you're talking about who we are currently, there's no reason, I think, to ask anybody to simply pretend to being who they are.
In fact, when the TV series It's Sin was aired recently, also about the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, the creator, Russell T Davies, said he wouldn't use straight actors to play gay characters. One reason to support this idea is the limited opportunities for gay actors, but instead they talked about truth and authenticity. It seems like there is now a wall between the experiences of gay people and the experiences of straight people. That means that Hanks, as a straight person, now wouldn't be able to express that experience on screen. This hasn't been the only such Hollywood controversy, and it's also part of the debate about white authors having black characters in their stories, a practice sometimes described as literary blackface. You can also see this idea in politics, often expressed in a certain phrase.
These inequities are not theoretical for me. They are a part of my lived experience.
In my life. My lived experience.
My lived experience.
Lived experience.
Lived experience. My lived experience, your lived experience is one that it's undeniable.
Okay, so maybe this already feels like another right-wing anti-woke attack video. And as a white guy, I'm just the type you'd expect to be making a video like this. But actually, as I've explored this idea that appears to be everywhere in politics and society, the critical voices that have been most persuasive, at least to me, have been those on the left. So that's what I'm looking at today. An idea that sounds sensible, but as we'll see, turns out to have a number of problems. And an idea that risks hurting the very people it was designed to help. The most basic part of the idea of lived experience is, I think, very reasonable. Whether it's sexual harassment, police violence, or rural poverty, there are people who have directly experienced these things, and so when we talk about these issues, we should hear their insights. The second part of this idea is that those insights are hard to share.
If you're not a woman, you don't understand. Maybe if you're not a woman of color, you don't understand.
Black people have a very different experience in this country that white people can't understand.
No, I'm sorry, can we just explain? You don't understand this because you're not gay, okay?
In other words, we can't share the unique insights that come from experience. Like with films and novels, there is a wall between those who are marginalized and those who aren't. And then, after the point about experience giving insight and the difficulty of sharing those insights, we have another step.
It's so necessary to listen to our communities, listen to people of color.
We need to listen to people with disabilities.
Listen to sex workers.
It's time to listen to women.
White folks have got to learn to listen to people of color.
Accept the reality and truths of what people are experiencing.
This is the problem. When we start talking about issues around race and racism, sometimes white people need to just listen.
Of course, I agree that listening is important, especially if you don't have any first-hand experience of the thing being talked about. But here the word listening is kind of ambiguous, meaning not just hearing what the person is saying, but doing what the person is saying. In other words, the idea is that you should defer.
Like I said, and I will stick by this, I will amplify other racialized journalists who have lived experience. It won't hurt me or my paycheck if I defer to somebody with lived experience on this issue.
The thinking appears to be that because you don't have the experiences of the marginalized groups, and these insights can't really be shared with you, then it's only right that you defer to that group. This cluster of ideas has been given various labels, but the one I think best sums it up is deference politics, from philosopher Olúfẹ Táíwò.
What I'm going to do is defer. Right? In general, I'm going to find a person who is of the right kind of social position, the right kind of oppressed group, maybe who has the right kind of social experiences, and whatever that person's political judgment is going to become my political judgment.
So while we all have access to our own sense of judgment, a sense of morality, reasoning, ability to look at the evidence and so on, here the idea is to put that to one side and instead defer. As Yascha Mounk explains in his book, the roots of this idea are in standpoint theory, an idea that developed in 1970s feminism. This idea was a powerful rejection of how social science was normally done, with supposedly neutral observers, typically white men, as the experts on what it's like to be marginalized. But standpoint theory said that not only should these experts recognize the bias that comes from their position, but they should listen to the unique insights that come from the experiences of marginalized people. Okay, so we've got this idea of deference politics, and we know that its roots lie in the academic idea of standpoint theory. But here's where the problems really start, when this idea starts to be applied to everyday politics. To explain what I mean, I want to show you this clip of Democrat politician Ayanna Pressley.
We don't need any more brown faces that don't want to be a brown voice. We don't need black faces that don't want to be a black voice. We don't need Muslims that don't want to be a Muslim voice. We don't need queers that don't want to be a queer voice.
Here we have the first part of deference politics. We need black voices representing black people in the debate. But notice, in this vision of politics, being a black face doesn't necessarily make you a black voice. It seems that for Pressley, the lived experience of being black should lead to a certain set of political views. And yet, she tells us, this doesn't always happen. As she puts it, you have black faces who aren't black voices. Pressley is right about this in the sense that there are many black people who are conservative, or who at least don't share her politics. Of course, the implication of what Pressley is saying is that these black conservative voices aren't really black, which is, I think, an ugly point of view. But the key thing for us is that lived experience doesn't lead to just one viewpoint. It can lead to many different viewpoints. My favourite example of this are the twins Shelby Steele and Claude Steele. Claude is famous for his work on the detrimental effects of racial stereotypes, while Shelby opposes affirmative action and argues the black community is as much to blame for its lack of advancement as racism. I mean, talk about similar lived experiences. These guys grew up as twins, and yet very, very different views. And this is a problem for deference politics, because if people in non-marginalized groups are meant to defer to those in marginalized groups, but the people in those marginalized groups have many different viewpoints, well, which view are we meant to defer to? What happens, of course, is that people only listen to the lived experiences of those whose politics they agree with, and ignore or cancel the others. But of course, choosing people based on whether their views agree with your own is unlikely to give you a representative voice. So activists will promote a marginalized person, but that person might not be in step with the views of the group they're supposedly representing. For example, Pressley has supported the defund the police movement, but this is a policy with little support amongst black voters. Or you'll see politicians using the term Latinx, popular with activists but with little resonance amongst those voters. Okay, so we've seen that part of deference politics is the idea that we should defer to those in marginalized groups. But as we've seen, people in those groups don't necessarily agree on any particular issue. The danger is we just pick the viewpoint we happen to agree with, leading to a distortion of what those groups think rather than any reality. It's all a bit of a mess, but it turns out there's an alternative.
And so we can't be sure that the particular oppressed person's opinion that we're getting is really representative. And even if we could be sure of that, that just isn't the question that we should be asking when it comes to knowledge. What is the world like? What should we do? That's not about who's talking, but that's about the world.
In other words, we should be using our own judgment, our own reasoning, morality, ability to sift evidence, and so on. After all, if this is about gaining insights, then we need to remember important insights aren't always captured by direct experience. In fact, that's one of the benefits of looking at racism structurally, trying to uncover unfairness in laws and policies which are only visible through collecting lots of data. And experiences without the context of data can be misleading. For example, Republican conventions have featured relatives of people killed by undocumented immigrants, sharing their lived experience, even though the crime rate for immigrants is well below those of native-born Americans. And it might be a bit old-fashioned, but those who suffer are not the only ones with insight. Think of a cancer patient. What they're experiencing is important, but so is the expertise of the doctor, whether they've had cancer themselves or not. Besides, there are situations where it's impossible not to use your judgment. Think of the debate between trans people and gender-critical women. Both of these groups are marginalized, and so in theory we should defer to them, but they're also in conflict. So how do we decide who to support without using our judgment? Deferring is lazy and ultimately condescending. Instead of turning off our thinking, we should use our own judgment. Doing otherwise avoids the work, the fun of what politics is often all about, listening to the ideas you're being presented with and deciding whether they make sense. Okay, so that's number one. Second, I don't think we should be so pessimistic about sharing insights. It's likely true that unless you've directly experienced something, you won't know what it's like. But in philosophy, there's sometimes a distinction made between experiential knowledge and propositional knowledge. In other words, unless I've eaten an apple, I won't really know what it's like. That's experiential knowledge. But I don't have to have eaten an apple to know its biology, how best to grow it, and so on. That's propositional knowledge. For an example of how this distinction works in politics, look at the issue of regulating sex work. One approach to doing this is called the Swedish model, whereby police, instead of going after the vulnerable sex workers, instead go after the buyers. This might sound attractive, but there's a problem, as explained by Juno Mack, who is herself a sex worker.
To keep safe in my work, I try not to take bookings from someone who calls me from a withheld number. If it's a home or a hotel visit, I try to get a full name and details. If I worked under the Swedish model, a client would be too scared to give me that information. I might have no other choice but to accept a booking from a man who is untraceable if he later turns out to be violent.
Mack is arguing, based on her lived experience, that this approach is a mistake. But notice, although her insight was helped by her lived experience, it wasn't impossible for her to communicate that insight to us. In philosophical terms, the knowledge has gone from experiential to propositional, and thus is easier to share. So yes, although we cannot directly access others' experiences, we do have empathy, and that's often enough for political action. My third and final objection is that these ideas are just not going to work politically. People don't want to be forced to just defer to other people, and it's not realistic to expect them to do so. More importantly, constantly telling people they don't know, they can't understand, instead of solidarity, you get division and competition.
Competition with people who are, in fact, oppressed by the same things, even if differently. And because you're in competition with them, or to the extent that you're in competition with them, you're not working with them to actually change the things that are oppressing the both of you.
Solidarity is needed if we want to build the coalitions that drive change. And solidarity is also why judgment is important. I mean, think about it. What if we supported ideas not through unthinking deference, but because we actually believed in them? Wouldn't that be better? And I understand that in a world that can be so relentlessly rubbish, deference politics seemed better than nothing. A little bit of conversational power that might compensate for pain elsewhere, especially when for years these voices weren't listened to at all. But these ideas come at a high cost.
So let's talk about what this case is really all about. The general public's hatred, our loathing, our fear of homosexuals.
We started this video with Philadelphia, a key moment in the fight against HIV stigma, but it was also a moment in the fight for gay rights. We've had similar moments in the last decade with a referendum on gay marriage.
Ireland became the first country in the world to pass a constitutional referendum allowing same-sex marriage.
And what helped these campaigns wasn't the idea that straight people couldn't understand the experiences of gay people. Instead, straight people were invited, with empathy and reasoning, to relate to what gay people were experiencing, the frustration of not being able to marry the person you loved. A gap was opened up in those walls that divide us, and the results of this were big wins for a group that had suffered injustice. Political change has more of a chance, not when we put up walls, but when we build what we have in common. Thanks for watching. My name is Brendan. I make this video series, The Ideas That Explain the News. The idea is that each video is a concept or idea that explains things on a deeper level, so that even after today's headlines have been forgotten, you'll still have something that will help you understand what's going on. If you found this video interesting, the next video you should watch is called The Frustration Machine. It's all about how the news media and social media interact to give us a distorted view on issues like racism and sexism. And it explains, I think, why those issues have become so fractious. So check it out.